but there's probably nobody better placed to talk about the politics of the environment than Tom Burke. So Tom, your 15-20 minutes now, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. It's 50 years since I joined a local group of Friends of the Earth. You talked about my long CV. It goes back that far. So I started as an environmentalist. And in a sense, what I'm going to do a bit is step back and look at both some of the failures that Catherine outlined and the tensions we've just heard about from Colin in a wider context of the development of politics and policy on the environment over that sort of period. When I started environmental campaigning 50 years ago, the challenge really was to extend the rule of law over what was then a completely uncolonized wild frontier of the environment. There was no Department of the Environment. There was no government policy on the environment. You couldn't look up environmental law in a library. There were no environmental lawyers. Indeed, there were really no environmental professionals of any kind. So we really have come somewhere since then. There is an environment department. The government has a 25-year environment plan, though it's not published a formal statement of its environment policy since 1990. There are a large number of environmental laws in the statute book, coming, as we've heard, under quite a lot of strain, and we party to a large number of international treaties. There's a vast legion now of environmental professionals, and of course there are several battalions of environmental lawyers. So in a way, the challenge has turned around. The post-Brexit challenge for the environment is for environmental campaigners and environmental professionals to work out how best to protect the rule of law from the politics of Brexit that we've just begun to hear some of explained. And we've seen a rising drumbeat of media story about this government's failures. Catherine talked about air pollution, but that's only one of the areas where government has consistently failed. And that drumbeat is likely to get louder as the drive to rebuild the economy, post-pandemic economy, accelerates, and there's more pressure brought to bear in the environment. Now, politics, in one sense, is simply the art of making choices together, and law is how we encode the more enduring of those choices in text or statute. Environmental law, if you like, is how we balance one person's freedom to drive their car against a mother's freedom from anxiety about her child's health, the freedom of some people to burn fossil fuels against the freedom of other people from wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. So in a way, today's question about what Brexit has done for environmental law is more than simply about what's in the text. It's about what happens to people. And so what matters most to those people, and as well as to the environment, are the outcomes the law promises, and if it's properly enforced, actually delivers. So if you like, in some sense, the question we're asking, paraphrasing that famous line from Monty Python, is what did EU law, environmental law, what's the EU environmental law done for us? Well, the past, as they say, is a foreign country, and we easily forget how things used to be, and that's as true of environmental law as it is of a city street. So here are some of the things, just to remind us, that the EU we used to take for granted in protecting the environment across the United Kingdom. Regular environmental action programs produced every 5 or 6 years that set out a forward-looking and evidence-based agenda for the future development of environmental policy and law. As we learned more about what human activities were doing to the environment, so issues were added to that agenda and discussion began about the appropriate policy and legal response. This made it possible for business and civil society organizations to plan strategically to get engaged in that process development. And by the way, that for all its frustrating operational practices and time it took, it was fantastically transparent compared to and accessible to everybody who wanted to get involved compared to the way our British policy making is conducted. So it also offered a clear sense of direction of travel of policy development which then allowed potentially affected parties the time and confidence to invest in innovative approaches to environmental solutions. So you could harness not just the constraining power of the law, but also the creative power of innovation, of investment, because you had that forward-looking perspective. Now, the publication of our Common Inheritance in 1990 was Britain's first comprehensive statement of policy on the environment that offered that kind of guidance to business and civil society. In the 27 years since then, there's been no publication of a UK framework such as that. Instead, what we've had is a succession of governments whose attention to environmental policy has probably best been described as intermittent. On occasion, there have been outbursts of arbitrary and rapid policy changes which are destructive to both business and civil society confidence, quite often driven not by evidence and not by real things, simply driven by headlines. And sometimes they've produced action on things like plastic straws, and sometimes they've defeated action, like a lot of things on energy policy. But that loss of regulatory stability is also going to be accompanied by an increase in the cost of regulation. The UK is now going to have to mirror a whole number of European agencies whose costs are currently shared with 27 other countries. That's going to matter most of all with the chemical industry as we try to create some sort of equivalent of the European Chemicals Agency to decide what chemicals are safe enough to be marketed. So difficulties already appearing just on one major issue that the EU used to do for us. But the second one, and there are lots more without getting in, but the second really big one was the fact that the EU had a powerful mechanism for the enforcement of environmental legislation, and therefore for the achievement of environmental goals. The prospect of appearing before the European Court of Justice was a compelling incentive on member states to comply with the requirements of environmental law. And that was a mechanism that backed the power of persuasion with the prospect of sanctions. It worked for the most part without the sanctions. It worked flexibly and efficiently and encouraged settlements. But the ability of the court to resort to sanctions was a fierce discipline on member states' actual behaviour. And the UK found that out to its cost when a failure to properly transpose the Nitrates Directive in Northern Ireland led to infraction proceedings under the European Commission, getting to the point just before they went to the court. To ward off what might have been daily fines that could have amounted to hundreds of millions of pounds, the government suddenly launched a crash programme which cost about 240 million to bring Northern Ireland into compliance. So you can imagine what might have happened if some of the problems that Catherine was talking about had actually got to the stage of going before the court, if we'd had to actually do something about air pollution instead of prevaricating as we've done. Now, I don't mean that was a mechanism that always worked very well. I'm a lifelong bird watcher, and the failure of the EU to properly enforce its legislation on the protection of migratory birds has long been a source of great frustration. But at least when we were inside the EU, we were able to press harder for better enforcement to protect our birds from the depredations of Southern European hunters. Well, we're out now. Brexit's done. We have regained our sovereignty. I have to say, as our fishermen have already discovered, we've not got our fish back. What now for environmental law in Britain? The promises are still there. To be the greenest government ever, to leave a better environment than it inherited. We were repeatedly told that environmental standards will not be allowed to fall now that we're out of the EU, but it's very striking how in the debate on the bill in the House, the government refused amendments that would have enshrined that promise in law. These are proud boasts. They're going to take some work. And while we've clearly seen some improvements in some aspects of Britain environment and a lot of greenish headlines, you would need to search very hard indeed to find convincing evidence that taken as a whole, the environment is better now than it was 10 years ago. So the promise the government can only be fulfilled if our own British environmental law can actually deliver better outcomes than were being delivered by EU law before Brexit. Now, putative generals, when they attend staff college, are instructed not to pay attention to opponent's intentions, but to his capabilities. And there is no doubt about the government's environmental intentions. I'm slightly reminded of that song from the 60s, I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Please don't let me be misunderstood. But what about its post-Brexit environmental capabilities? We've somehow managed to arrive at an extraordinary paradox. Our environment is under increasingly visible stress. The public is more aware than ever of that stress and more supportive of vigorous action to reduce it. Yet our machinery for managing the environment is weaker now than it was in the last century. A few recent headlines define that point. I read in one, Natural England, cut to the bone and unable to protect wildlife, says staff. Very next day, DEFRA lacking clear plan for meeting environmental goals, watchdog warns. Just this morning, I read UK's native woodlands reaching crisis point. None of those headlines were a surprise to anybody who's been involved in environmental policy and law at all. We no longer have a Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution. We no longer have a Sustainable Development Commission. We no longer have a powerful Department of the Environment. DEFRA became and has largely remained an annex of the Agriculture Department. The planning system in Britain has been so degraded that it is now little more than an advisor to developers. Neither Natural England nor the Environment Agency retain genuine independence of government. Both have had their budgets cut to the bone and their ability to perform their role as statutory advisors chilled. The government's environmental intentions are burgeoning just as its capabilities are in steep decline. This is not a prescription for the success of either environmental policy or environmental law in post-Brexit Britain. And as we've heard, much of the burden of delivering an environment that matches government's intentions will fall on the soon-to-be-created Office of Environmental Protection. I can't say that this proposal fills me with confidence. Its only recourse to sanction failures by the government to obey its own laws seems to be judicial review. Well, this isn't the moment to rehearse the sorry history of judicial review as a whole. Let me simply point out that it's the very process that the government is currently promising out of the other side of its mouth to weaken. So I think I'm going to be looking for a lot of other developments before I believe there is anything more than a torrent of green headlines to be expected. One of the things we're not short of in Britain is the good science and administrative skills to develop an environmental policy and its implementing law to see us safely through the stresses of the 21st century. But they have little value without the political will to use them. The problem with political will is that it is as ephemeral as yesterday's headlines. So it needs to be reinforced by a stronger institutional framework. Interesting to see how much better that's been recognized in Scotland than it has been in England. And here are some of the elements of such a framework that would certainly build my confidence that the future of environmental policy and law in post-Brexit Britain is secure. Some bit of this will sound familiar to what Colin was saying. An Office of Environmental Protection with the power to impose fines on ministers whose departments are found to be in breach of their legal obligations. A reconvened Royal Commission of the Environment to look systematically at the full range of future environmental challenges. An Environmental Audit Committee of Parliament with similar staff and powers to that of the Public Accounts Committee to create effective parliamentary oversight of the government's delivery of its environmental promises. Full restoration of the independence of the Environment Agency in National England, neither of which now have their own websites, with Parliament rather than government setting their budgets, and a requirement for an Office of the Office of Budgetary Responsibility to conduct an annual audit of the consistency of public spending plans with the government's environmental objectives. You only have to look at the contrast between what the government is going to spend on the issue it's telling us frequently is the most important issue that on the environment facing it now, climate change. When you looked at the last budget and compared what it was spending to do with climate change, the 27 billion it was going to spend on roads, you got a pretty fair idea of why maybe you'd need to have somebody like the Office of Budget Responsibility paying attention to that sort of detail. I simply think the people of Britain want an environment policy that they can have confidence is capable of meeting the challenges of the future. I've set out some of the things I think to meet that. I was really interested to see the extent to which some of them have been picked up in the devolved administration. I would have thought if you were the SNP, you would now be very busily promoting the environment as another reason why Scotland would want to leave England. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Tom. Very enlightening, if not wholly cheering. And I thought your point was particularly useful that the UK government's environmental intentions are burgeoning just as its capabilities are in steep decline. Before moving to the sort of panel discussion, I think you and I sort of shared the view that leaving the European Union was going to be a bad thing for the environment, and we've got a lot of ground to make up. Can I just put to you the argument that's been made by quite a lot of people, I mean, Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government, for instance, which is that over the years, the UK environmental movement kind of focused on getting changes in Brussels, which it knew it could get, legal changes, and sometimes neglected winning hearts and minds politically, domestically in the UK, and that actually leaving will give us the opportunity to sort of entrench changes which are, as it were, politically owned rather than legally imposed on ministers. Do you ever have any hope in that sense?
I think Jill has part of the story right, which is that the environmental NGOs in effect became much better at lobbying than at grassroots campaigning, and that remains a problem for the environmental NGOs in Britain. I don't think she's right about that. I think it's a nice hope that Jill has that somehow it's going to get better, but I have a reason for that. My sense is that quite a lot of the collapse of real political commitment on the environment in Britain, particularly by the Conservatives, has been the importation largely from America of quite a lot of political philosophy that says we can't possibly win an argument against the environment and all that entails. But what we can do is a whole series of things that take away the capability to deliver. So you don't change environmental law because that would be unpopular. You just do what Francis Maude was proposing to right at the beginning of in 2010, and that is you give yourself in secondary legislation the power to get rid of any public body you chose. So you wouldn't change the law, you'd simply get rid of Natural England and the Environment Agency. So you gut the law. And I think there's quite a lot of that going on. What's happened to the planning system has gone on. You will know this better than anybody should. What's happened to the planning system has been a sustained assault on its ability to balance conflicting economic interests, which has largely gone unnoticed and uncommented on, both by the NGO community as a whole and by the British media. So I think there's a political project in that. I don't think it's simply an accident. That's why I don't share Jill's hope.
Thanks, Tom.